Your party seems to be accusing the Prime Minister of not actually getting rid of it and raising questions about the document that was signed on Friday. What's your argument there?
So Mark Carney isn't able to unilaterally repeal legislation. So this is the exactly. And so as noted by this member of the media, Mark Carney is not repealing the carbon tax. And he's not able to do that because it's required that Parliament passes that law. Now, if there was a commitment from the Carney-Trudeau Liberals to do this, they would have done it in Parliament. But the fact is that 100% of Mark Carney's cabinet ministers have voted more than a dozen times for the carbon tax. These are the same Liberals who promised in the 2019 election that the carbon tax would not go up. They lied. They then promised after they raised it, it would not go up. They lied again. Now here we are on the eve of an election when Mark Carney needs Canadians' votes. And he's saying that he has zeroed the price that they've put on the carbon tax. But when Mark Carney doesn't need Canadians' votes, but he does need their money, he is absolutely going to put the carbon tax in place, and you don't need to take my word for it. Listen to what Mark Carney has said when he said that he will use what he described as a shadow carbon price. This is a guy who doesn't think that by taxing things like steel at the very time that Donald Trump says that he's going to put tariffs on Canadian steel, that that's not going to be a cost that is passed on to consumers, that that's not going to cause an increase in prices for Canadians. So you just need to listen to Mark Carney if you want to know if there's going to be higher prices and more taxes for Canadians if he were to be elected. And of course, common sense Conservatives have said that we will axe the tax for everyone forever.
Do you want him to give up this money that comes from the carried interest? Like, concretely, what would satisfy you?
Mr. Carney needs to be transparent with Canadians. Now, if he wants to avoid the conflict of interest, he should divest, and not divest into a blind trust. It would mean that he would need to sell those assets, not to forfeit those assets or the payments that come from these carried interest assets to him. But the fact is right now, when he's been asked if he is going to be a beneficiary of these funds, he's refused to say. And so, first of all, we need to know what the truth is, which is always hard to know when you're getting answers from Mark Carney. And then he needs to do the right thing and to avoid even the appearance of a conflict of interest. Look, these Liberals have broken Canadians' trust after 9 years. They've been a government of serial ethical lawbreakers. Justin Trudeau twice found guilty of breaking this very law. We had Dominic LeBlanc. We had Mary Ng. We had the former finance minister, Bill Morneau. We had the parliamentary assistant to the Prime Minister, Greg Fergus. They all disregarded this law. And so we need to see from Mark Carney, instead of non-answers, full disclosure.
Do you think the Prime Minister should call an election right away?
First of all, Parliament should have been sitting since the last week of January. These doors have been padlocked by the Carney-Trudeau Liberals, trying to avoid the accountability and the scrutiny that comes with a sitting Parliament. So we had a performative scene with Mr. Carney claiming to cancel a law all by himself the first day that he was sworn in, but that's not how it works here in Canada. Only Parliament can pass and rescind laws. And these are the kinds of things that should be debated and passed in Parliament. Look, Conservatives have called for Parliament to be sitting so that we could pass a plan that puts Canadians first, to pass a big bring-it-home tax cut for Canadians, to repeal the Liberals' anti-energy laws like Bill C-69, to tear down interprovincial trade barriers, to remove taxes like the carbon tax permanently, like the tax on new home construction. But two things can be true at the same time. If the government isn't prepared to pass legislation that puts Canada first, then Canadians should decide in an election. And so while Parliament should have been sitting, Conservatives are saying that if the Carney-Trudeau Liberals aren't prepared to put Canada first by passing that legislation in the House of Commons, then it's time to take that to Canadians in an election.
You'd rather he recall Parliament than go to an election right now?
Parliament should be sitting. So that point needs to be crystal clear, that Parliament should have been sitting since the last week of January. But if Mark Carney isn't going to allow parliamentarians to debate laws and to pass legislation that puts Canadians first, then Canadians need to vote in an election, and we believe that they'll vote for a party that will put Canada first, like Canada's Conservatives.
Can I just ask you, Michael, just about, we've all seen the polls. I know politicians don't like to comment on polls except for the election day one. Nonetheless, the polls have narrowed. Clearly, some Canadians are looking at the potential prime ministers and making a different choice than they might have made 6 months ago. And I wonder if you have some thoughts about why the Liberals might be back in the game. Is it because, for example, that Canadians don't know enough about the implications of this conflict of interest, the potential conflict of interest, or what other things do Canadians maybe need to consider about Mr. Carney, aside from what you've presented today?
Well, a couple of things. It's not surprising that the Carney-Trudeau Liberals have tried to hide Mark Carney from questions. We saw him not take questions for extended periods of time between the debates and the Liberal leadership and the swearing in at Rideau Hall. So they've been trying to hide him. They've avoided, of course, the scrutiny of Parliament by locking parliamentarians out of the House of Commons. So they don't seem to want the scrutiny that would come with any of those accountability measures, like talking to the media or dealing with parliamentarians. When it comes to what Canadians are thinking, this past week, I've knocked on hundreds of doors. To go back to your question on if I think there should be an election, I've knocked on hundreds of doors this past week, and the message that I've heard from Canadians is that they're exhausted after the last 9 years of these Carney-Trudeau Liberals. They're finding it increasingly difficult to get by, to make ends meet. I talked to one couple on Thursday evening, and they described themselves as formerly middle class. And I said, when did that change? They said about 10 years ago. And they said they found it harder and harder to try and make ends meet. They downsized. They moved into their son's home with him. And these are incredibly difficult times. Now, the message that we've shared with them, our Canada First plan, that's going to help increase the prosperity of Canada, of Canadians, by getting our natural resources to market, by, of course, passing the tax cuts that we've proposed for Canadians, that we have talked about ending the out-of-control spending and inflationary deficits of these Liberals, and of course protecting Canadians who are terrified. They're terrified with the chaos that they're seeing in their communities and on the streets, with our commitment to have jail and not bail for repeat violent offenders. This message resonates very well. And so with the scrutiny that comes with what I hope will be tough questions and consistent pressure from the media for Mark Carney to answer for things like these unknown financial interests, unknown conflicts of interest. And because he's avoiding the accountability of the House of Commons, the increased accountability that will come with an election, Canadians are going to see that Mark Carney really is just like Justin Trudeau. Mark Carney's only complaint with something like the carbon tax, for example, over the last few years, is that it wasn't high enough. And so when given the scrutiny, when Canadians have the opportunity to compare a leader in Pierre Poilievre, who's committed to lower taxes and to put Canada first, and a carbon copy of Justin Trudeau in Mark Carney, we look forward to the increased scrutiny that he'll receive.